Welcome back, Range Seekers. So this is the second part in our Pike series. If you took notes from last week, I suggest you grab your notes so you can follow along. If you haven't checked out that one, obviously check it out first because a lot of this one won't make sense without the context of that one. Other than that, enjoy and let's get to it. First thing I'd like to also move on to is we have this thing called the sit and reach test. The sit and reach test is used in a lot of places to test flexibility of athletes. And genuinely, it's a pretty shit test. It only tests flexibility in one position. And then people are giving a score like, oh, you have achieved, you see it in the army, I think it's part of the military fitness test. And yeah, depending on your country, it's used in different places. It was definitely used in sports when I was in secondary school, that they'd test your flexibility with the sit and reach test. Sit and reach test is performed with a box that has a bit of a diving board, kind of like plank, what has markings on it. It has minus numbers, minus 30 centimeters and plus 30 centimeters, or something like that, if I remember correctly. And then you will put the feet there, and the 0 point is where the feet are flexed against it, and wherever you can reach to is your thing. There's a bit of tasking involved, so that's pretty cool. It can give you a hint on that, and it's always good to retest a few times. But at the same time, it's only testing flexibility, basically one position, one joint, and one relationship to gravity. So it's not a comprehensive flexibility test. And you can't really say, oh, someone has plus 20 centimeters in the sit and reach test. You can't really say this person is flexible. It means they're only flexible in this one circumstance. So, it's probably once again, it goes into the bigger education of flexibility training is we need to have a more comprehensive flexibility assessment, both in our active flexibility, dynamic flexibility, and passive flexibility. We'll probably talk about that in a full episode. But it just gives you an idea. I'm sure a lot of you have encountered this sit and reach or have seen it or possibly have been tested on it for some kind of athletic scholarship. I know it's definitely I know the American football combine, if I remember right, uses the sit and reach test as one of their tests, which is, that combine test is a bit weird, isn't it? It's kind of like a cattle mart for athletes. Like they weren't scouted, but then they can turn up and then they have a battery of kind of physical tests to compare them to. And they go in and the kind of coaches will poke and prod and see, they have everything. Bench press reps, sit and reach, running, obviously, muscularity, take your top off, do some bodybuilding poses. Yeah, it's very, very old school. And as far as I understand, it hasn't really been updated. So, yeah, anyway, enough of the cattle mart. So, there is two ways to approach any flexibility position. There is the holistic way and what I term the alchemical way. And what I mean by the alchemical way is anyone who is familiar with the idea behind alchemy. The idea behind alchemy is, obviously it's the search for gold. That's what we're trying to get. A golden position, top marks, the best position we can get. One of the ways the alchemists of old would do this would be they would say they wanted to make a medicine out of a plant, and they would try to break the plant down into its most perfect component, into its components, and then perfect those components, and then put them back together to make a perfect version of the plant or a perfect version of the plant medicine. So we're trying to do that. We can do the same thing in the Pike. And, I'm using the term alchemical here. Some of you might be familiar with Physical Alchemy by Dave Wardman, who's a good friend of mine. I'm really not related to that, but I'm robbing the term. And you encounter this a lot in systems like stretch therapy, where they are trying to identify the tight link in your position, stretch that, and then the global position emerges from perfecting this one link. This is incredibly important in the Pike stretch, because if we think about the classic one we get in the Pike is I feel it on the back of my calves. And people have been told, oh, you're stretching nerves if you feel it there. Maybe you are. And, if you're tight, you're probably putting everything in the system under a bit of a stretch. And in this, we can go, well, there's a field test for this. You feel it in your calves. Okay, I'll do a stretch. So I'll do a Pike, and that's where the restriction is. Oh, I feel it in my hips. I feel it in my lower back. Well, then I will perform a stretch for that. And our field test for this is we will perform a good quality passive stretch in a relaxed manner for about 60 to 90 seconds and then retest the position we were trying to do. So Pike, let's say we'll stretch our calves, or we feel it only on one leg. This is the thing, we could have bilateral asymmetries in our flexibility. And then I'll retest, or in our hamstrings, or in our glutes, or in our piriformis, all these kind of positions. And then we will retest the Pike and go, did it improve? Did the first thing we're looking is, did the sensation change? The sensation changed and I feel it move into my hamstrings where I want to feel the stretch. Not that we exactly want to feel it there, but it changes the sensation. There's some tangible change to sensation. Or even better, we go deeper. So then we can go more precise in our training, go like, I want a deeper Pike. My calves are my weak link. So I will stretch my calves as the main kind of development stretch. I will work on the strength of the tibialis anterior. I will work on, it could even be done standing calf raises. We have a couple other calf stretches that I'll talk about. Then we will retest the Pike. It gets better. Then we know, our training can be focused towards this one thing, which is the restriction, and not do a lot of Pike stretching. Remove the restriction and then check in with the Pike, and then it's gotten better. So it's the same thing that we can, if we follow along the posterior chain of the body, so this includes the soles of the feet, the lower compartment of the leg, so the calves, all this, calves, tibialis posterior, inferior, all this, hamstrings, glutes, hip rotators, particularly depending on how much the hip is flexed, it will depend on which rotators are going, the lumbar spine, the lats to a certain degree, the mid-back, the neck, and even the top of the head, even the eyebrows, even the jaw as well can play into this. So with this in mind, we can actually start to target where it might be our tight parts, train them and train exercise that is appropriate to that, and then put it back together into a more perfect, into the golden Pike. So you can see where I'm getting at. So I'm going to go through a few examples of some exercises. I'm going to just describe them, and you're going to have to try and iterate them based on my audio description. Maybe I'll make some videos of them later. So one of the first great Pike stretches I really like, or stretches for the calves when the calves are restriction. One, it's the standing calf raise. Standing calf raises off a ledge. It's, there's not that many, well, for my purposes in training, there's not that many useful machines in a gym, but the standing calf machine is worth its weight in gold for just developing calf flexibility. It's one of these things that there's a rule of thumb in exercise is the further away a body part is from your glutes and abs, because let's face it, all the training is about getting a bigger ass and better abs, the further it is from them, and maybe the chesticles, but the further it is away from those, the less likely people are to train it. And you can think about this yourself. It's like, how often do you train your neck? Not that often. How often do people train their calves? Not that often. How often do they train their forearms? Well, they'll train the kind of the meaty bit of the forearm, but are they training the wrist and the finger strength? Not a lot in the general populations. Not for you guys who are listening into this, because obviously you're much more educated and are doing that, hopefully. So we have the standing calf machine. And then the standing calf machine, we can also use it in the same manner that we would use the Jefferson curl. When I was talking about using the weight forcing me down, so the vector is assisting the stretch of the calves. Then at the same time, I will pull my toes up and try with all my might. It's harder to get a task on here, so you have to kind of do a visual task. Trying to pull the toes using tibialis anterior and whatever muscles extend the toes to the shins, and that pulls me deeper into the stretch. So I'll go down, we'll pull deeper, we go out. We can do this for repetitions, but my favorite with the calves is we hold it for time. It just seems to work better. You can get a lot of bang for buck from reps, and obviously the other thing with calves is they can generally handle a lot of weight once you get used to them. You kind of have to kind of commit to the weight. I can remember, if we go into the apocrypha of bodybuilding, I don't know how true it is, but Arnold Schwarzenegger, his calves were not developed, and he had to do all the shots in standing knee deep in water because his calves were embarrassing. They're probably fucking stacked compared to most of us, but they're embarrassing for a bodybuilder. And he had to work up to like 1,000 pounds on standing calf raises before they started to go. So we can use that idea and try to build up in poundages, maybe 500 pounds, what's that in kilos? 220 kilos, something like that. Obviously build up and take your time and build up your reps. It is also a funny thing, there is the dog crap, so DC training, it's a dog crap or Dante Trudel. They have a calf protocol which involves doing calf raises for sets of 12 and 15 reps if I remember right, and you hold each rep for a 15-second stretch. That is it's definitely worth doing. Give it a go. Don't hate me afterwards. It will definitely get your calves moving. I like the 90-second positions. I also like to differentiate between which head of the gastrocnemius is the tightest. So you will see this in, depending, there's two ways to find out. One, you can find out by sensation and go, oh, I do my toes pointing forward, neutral foot position, and the lateral side or the medial side is tighter. So then I can actually bias that in my stretch by turning the feet in slightly or out slightly. Now we're talking, if the big toe is pointing at 12, we'd point the big toe at 1 o'clock, or we'd point the big toe at 12 o'clock. No, 11 o'clock, sorry. So not a big the griffins, but you feel that will shift the load onto whichever edge of the gastrocnemius will be tighter. So if you're doing sets of calf raises and you go, oh, this is my actual weak spot, then you could do all your sets targeted on that weak spot and bring that up and get that more flexible, and then your pike would improve on this. You could also, if there's a big difference, asymmetry in the calves, which there is for a lot of people, then I would suggest doing them single-legged and working on that. So that is one calf exercise to try. At the same time, we were applying the idea of tibialis anterior. We could also train tibialis anterior, so we could superset them, which is a very nice exercise. We could also work isometrics in the tibialis anterior by hooking them under something in a standing position and trying to contract them as hard as we can against this. So when we get into our deeper calf position, then we have the muscles have been facilitated to actively pull us deeper. So we're going to get a hint of some of the techniques. So we'd use an overcoming isometric on the shortening side of the joint to facilitate the muscles and also to give us a better feeling and sensation for when we turn them on or when they turn off. So we're generating strength, facilitation, and coordination. Excellent. Then at the same time, once we have that turned on, we have a good feeling for that, then we would do our calf raises and alternate back and forth. Okay, so we're following along. So my next kind of, high tier calf position is the foot elevated hip hinge. So what this would do is you would put your foot up on a step on a bit of stairs is quite useful for this, but you can, whatever you got, yoga block, wedge. Yoga blocks are a bit, if they're cork ones are nice. If they're the foam ones, because you're going to put a lot of weight on it, they can be less than ideal, but they work. Stack of plates, whatever you have to hand really. So you will put a hip hinge, you will lock the knee straight, you're going to do one leg at a time, and it's like a stride stance, good morning, and I will hinge forward, loading the calves. Then at the same time, my hips will go backwards because I've got good hinging technique. And then once I get into depth, I will push forward with the head. We could also have, I like using a stairs for this actually, because then I can track the distance I'm touching on a step. If I was either making contact with my elbows or my hands, or if I'm holding weight, I can see that I've gone further forward. This will give an immense stretch on the calf, also the hamstrings as well, but if the calves is the limitation, you will feel it there. And then to initiate the coming back, I'll push the foot through the ground. It won't move from that position, or hopefully the heel won't come off. But that engagement of the calf will initiate the backward shift of the hips, and then I'll extend the hips. Following along, I expect to see some videos of this, and if anyone sends me videos of this, I will form check them. Just DM them to me on Instagram on the Modern Methods of Mobility account, and I'll critique them if you want. Or one of us will. So we have this, and then there is also a single leg foot elevated Jefferson curl variation to try out. So I won't describe that because it should be pretty clear at this stage, but that one is also very torturous but very effective. But take it very gentle on that one. Don't go gung-ho. Use no weight to begin with, and then very slowly increment the weight. So hopefully that's giving you some ideas for the calves. The next thing is the relative flexibility of the hamstrings. One of the limitations of the hips, if we think of the hips, they're basically like the scapula, but they're joined together. That's one way I like to think of the hips. It's not exactly right, but it's a nice way to think about it before anyone goes, it's not like that. And if the hips are joined together and they're trying to tilt evenly, but one leg reaches its maximum amount of anterior tilt before the other one, then that's when you will have a limitation in it. The way around this is unilateral stretching. So we will go back to our stride stance good mornings, which I have a video on YouTube for. And these are very useful for this. Stride stance Jefferson curls as well. There's a nice way of doing these where I'll bend the leg up, similar to how we would do a Bulgarian split squat. So it's out of the way, but I also am quite well supported. Balance is a challenge on this as well, but this can help a lot. Then it's the same idea as usual. We'll go into position, we'll try pull ourselves deeper. It also could be the relative strength of the hip flexion involved muscles as well. So that's one way of doing it. And then it's the same idea. I find one tight side, so let's say my left side is just massively behind. I've had some grade 1 or 2 tears in the hamstrings over the years that were not fully rehabilitated or something like this. And I focus on that. You could also only train that side. You don't want to, but you could, and I have tested this out. And you could improve the bilateral position by working on one specific weak link. If it's behind, you could also do one extra set. So I'm training unilateral hamstring, some kind of variation on this. I'll do one extra set for the side that's behind. That's a tip I got from Kit Lachlan. So try it out. You don't need to do a lot of sets. You could do all your sets, obviously, as I said, but that's what we're looking for. The next limitation if we're pursuing this alchemical thing is piriformis. Piriformis, once the hips tilt past 90 degrees, will come under stretch in this position. By checking and seeing if my piriformis is limited, I could stretch my piriformis and then retest my hamstring. Piriformis, I have a whole piriformis video, so check it out on YouTube. It's got a lot of things on it. So you could stretch piriformis and then do my pikes. This is, we could train that first and then do my pike development. So we're going to see we got a bit of a program here. We might do 2 sets of something for the calves, 2 sets of something from the piriformis, then train our Jefferson curl. And then suddenly we'll have a much bigger range of motion if these are limitations. These are things to try out. So the lumbar spine can be one of these positions where a lot of people, because they round over a lot, or they try to prawn out and don't extend eventually, or they haven't reached the degree of lumbar, the lumbar can be a limitation. And there is some people who are kind of locked in lumbar extension. I've come across this with not a huge amount, but it's common with powerlifters. A lot of powerlifters as well. If you find you are a type of person who gets a lower back pump from leg training, lumbar spine will generally not be able to flex as nice as possible. So obviously we would do articulation exercises, things like cat-cows and spinal roll downs, but we could also just train the ability to flex the lumbar spine. The simplest way to do this is the bent leg calf, where we're focused on just rounding the spine over, or a splayed position. This could be too difficult for some. It's one of the ones. It's also with the lumbar spine, we get into this idea of lateral flexion. The erector spinae, or the QL, the quadratus lumborum, or the obliques can be tighter, relatively tighter on one side versus the other. And training this in either a standing side bend, that's generally my favorite one. Standing side bends with the legs, we take them about a 3-step horse stance distance apart, or your squat stance, enough that you're stable. We will keep the weight centered on the feet. So what you want to feel is that there's still a close to 50-50 distribution of the weight, and it's not going 80%, 90% to one leg, vice versa. And then we'll go down. We can do this, one, holding a weight, and that will pull us down. Once again, we apply the idea of tasking. Is the weight contacting my thigh? Cool. Can I go deeper? We can also train the shortening side of the joint by using a cable station and trying to pull ourselves deeper into the position by going down and open up the side of the body. This one is loads of fun as well. It's definitely worth trying out. I fully recommend that one. It's just try it out and you'll understand why. And if we have a big difference on lateral flexion of the spine, we will have a difference in forward flexion. So this is one of the ones we want to iron out as well, that we want to get them roughly the same. Maybe they're not going to be exactly the same, but we want to even them out. If you can go like right over and there's a good like 60-70 degree curve of the spine on one side and the other side is 45 degrees, we got some work to do. So you can always take a photo of yourself or a video and compare side to side and go, okay, one side is tighter, that might be limiting my pike position. Same with so where am I going to go? So I want to go to neck next. The neck is definitely one of these positions that if we are limited in the neck and we're unable to touch our chin to our chest, this can limit our, basically if we think the whole body is connected, and while we talk about isolating muscles, we're not really doing it. It's basically impossible to do, and the body works as a system. The neck, you'll see this in people who, you see this in hip hinging a lot. People go to hip hinge and they try to hip hinge and then the neck extends. And a lot of the time this can be the body sucking the flexibility from one zone and going to the other. There was a nice paper on this that one of my students, or former students, Mikkel Slice on Instagram, brought up, showing that there's fascial motion connected in the calf when the hip goes into anterior tilt. And it's quite easy to see a projection that there will be fascial motion compared in the calf, as well as nerve motion as well, if you think of sciatic nerve and all that as well, when the head tilts and the cervical spine goes into flexion. So we have this idea that, if we tilt, if we say hip hinge, do a Romanian deadlift type position or a stiff leg deadlift, then if we can't get if we start extending the cervical spine, we can think that the body is sucking flexibility from one position to solve the task at hand and putting it somewhere else. It's kind of like a rubber band being pulled at one end and the other end isn't fixed, so it just goes along with it. Whereas we want to tilt that over. Stretching the neck. Generally, we don't do a lot of active work on the neck, but training your neck sit-ups and stuff like this can be a great aid to the pike. So that's a lot of things to think about and a lot of things to try out. The other kind of thing I want to talk about is body size. It's one of these things, if we were to look at the elongation forces of the spine, if we were to take someone who was like, I don't know, big ass power lifter, like heavyweight, and then we have their spine and the stomach and the organs, we can think of them like a ball, and they're trying to bend forward and compress this ball. And it's kind of like, I don't know if you ever tried to bend an iron bar or a pipe. If I want to bend the pipe and I trying to get it to curve, I try to bend and it's really stiff. It's really difficult and I can't do it. It's like a metal bar. If I put it over my leg, suddenly it has something to bend around. There's more force going into the spine. And this can be one of the things that can be misunderstood, where if I have a big person and I try to get them to do Jefferson curls, because of the force of the spine being bending around the organs in the stomach, then they're experiencing more basically resistance out of a lighter weight in a Jefferson curl than someone who was really skinny and was like sucking the stomach in. So this is one of the things to consider when you're programming for your clients, is like, what is the girth of this person in their abdominal section? Are they a big person or are they skinny? Are they skinny? Maybe they'll be able to do more weight. If they're kind of girthy, maybe they're getting the same training stimulus in terms of strengthening and other stuff with less weight. It's just something to think about, and something, it's kind of one of those things. We're going to do anthropomorphy in a different episode, so I'll talk a bit more on these variances there. So one of the key things in a flexibility position, to say you own it, is the ability to deep breathe. And this becomes more important in the pike and pancake than, bridge. The breathing is always going to be restricted, and extension positions with So one of the things we want to be able to do is when we're in this position, seated, standing, is be able to abdominally breathe. And not just abdominally breathe, torso breathe, so the whole torso inflates. Other students who are on our M3 program know we have a video on dissolution breathing. And one of the stages of dissolution breathing is this big inflation of the whole body. We're trying to, if we think about the body itself, the whole body expands when you breathe, and the spine gets longer. If the spine gets longer and the joints open, people who've done to the seminar have seen the thumb test, where we compress the thumb joint and it shuts down the power to the arm. And we've seen it on different proprioceptive activation on that, and the Ruffini endings and stuff like this. But if we open the spine with our breathing and open all the joints of the torso, this will allow us to express more range of motion quite easily. At the same time, if the position is too difficult for us and we're breathing super hard or super shallow, then we are missing out on this effect, and we can't say we own the position at this range of motion we're training in. So it's definitely one of these things to think about. One of the other counterintuitive things is when we exhale in the pike in particular is withdrawing the navel to the spine. So we're thinking, breathe in, I inflate, breathe out, and then I will pull the navel in like a stomach vacuum. And one of the interesting things about this is if we think about the organs are quite mobile in the body. They move more than we think. Most of your breathing cycles, a lot of the organs will move up and down 2 to 3 centimeters. So we can hijack this effect and pull the organs out of the way and squish them up into the chest. And this allows us to potentially create the ability to squish or move into position with the pelvis or anything down there. And then this will get us deeper into the position. Then when we breathe back in, the organs will get squished by this new contact point, and we can repeat this process. So there's a lot going on basically. One of the other key things we want to think about is trying to think of a way to describe this, is we want to think about always pulling up with the femur. So I'm trying to pull the femurs deeper into the socket. And as we kind of know, people with deeper hip sockets are generally more flexible in the hips. There's always a lot of variance in the hips. But this idea of trying to pull my femur and the head of the femur as deep into the socket as I can is one of the things that will help the bending and help the feeling of the sit bones come up and over. So I think femurs go back. And there's a really nice way to play with this, that if I was to get a very light, generally a TheraBand is the easiest way to feel this, or a light jump stretch band. TheraBand is like a light one. I'd tie it on, I'd tie it around my ankle, I'd sit my pike, and then I'd try to, like I was pulling a rope, try to pull that band into the socket and just feel what that contraction goes on and get a good sensation for that. Then when I'm going into either my standing pike, my hanging leg lift, anything, I will try to replicate that feeling as best I can and then start to enter the position and maintain it. So this is so this is one of the things. Suck the femur through the back of the pelvis, like go bigger than you think you need to, and then maintain it. And that will allow the hip to hopefully flex a bit more. The other thing is that when the hip tilts over, the quads have to be, it's a weird thing. The quads have to be actively working, so they have to be tense, but they can't be too tense because they'll limit it, because they'll be too hard. They won't be able to squish out of the way. So this is why we need a lot of strength in the compressive side of the hip, basically, and the rectus femoris and the psoas and iliacus and all this, so that they can tense and actively pull us down. But the amount of force they're exerting in this position is less than their maximum contraction, which will make them very hard. So it's kind of, if you think about it, the easiest way to feel this is if I make a fist and squeeze 30%, I can still grab my forearm and sink the thumb into it and squish the muscle. If I squeeze everything or crush a ball or fully irradiate, then I won't be able to get my thumb in as deep. So it's this idea that like the more strength we have on the shortening side of the joint, the less they have to contract to help aid the position. And then at the same time, they can, because they're not as tense and not maximally tense or maximally contracted, they can flow out of the way. So one of the things that always comes up in the pike stretch is the sciatic nerve. The sciatic nerve, this is the kind of things that in my sort of more recent studies on the nervous system, is like, we have named all these nerves and they have names, we've named the branches. There's only really one nerve in the body and it branches off, and we've named the branches and we've called them a discrete thing. But the sciatic nerve, for our purposes here anyway, runs down the back of the leg. It emerges via the nerve branches of the lumbar spine, the sacral branches, and then they coalesce together. They go out the back of the pelvis. So they kind of go from the spine, underneath, and then out the gap in the pelvis, which, if I can remember off the top of my head, is the sciatic foramen or something like that. Someone can correct me on that, or just look it up on Wikipedia and find out. And what happens in the sciatic nerve is we have all these branches and they can join at different places. So we have different types of, we have one that can lie below the piriformis. We have one that actually goes through the piriformis. We have a nerve when they can bifurcate. So the Western science generally recommends three types. A whole sciatic nerve, that where all the branches that come off the spine are joined together before it passes below or through the piriformis. We have one where it bifurcates as it passes through the piriformis and then rejoins. And then we have other people, we can even have people who will trifurcate, like have 3 or 4 branches, and then they'll join back together. And then you have other, I think there's even people where it's basically, the sciatic nerve can be thought of as 2 thicker branches that are inside the same fascial tube, the same connective tissue tube. So with this, if the piriformis isn't strong enough in this position, or it's tense from training or other stuff, it can provide compression to this nerve. If it provides compression to this nerve, we can get nerve sensations, which can range from very intense. Generally, the way to tell when the nerve is tight is, they say the back of calves, it's not a great test. It will also be the tingling sensation, a loss of sensation in the legs, a loss of muscle control, because the sciatic nerve is more a motor nerve. It controls muscle contraction. It doesn't have a lot of sensory branches. So if we had compression of the femoral nerve, which comes through the front of the pelvis and innervates the front of the leg, we'd have a loss of sensation as well. And it's quite a, it's one of these ones encountered a bit from, encounter it in aerial. A lot of people who do rope and other stuff can have a loss of sensation from the nerve compression that causes a, what do you call it? I can't remember the name for the exact thing, but it's a compression of the nerve that causes a sensory loss along the front of the thigh. You can have patches of skin that have no sensation. So this sciatic nerve, it's one of the ones where people will go, oh, my nerves are tight. And, it's one of these things that is can be a flexibility cheat code, basically, that we would do a nerve flossing type exercise before our stretch and see if that in it. Generally, it's a flexibility cheat code. So you would have to do it almost every time as part of your warm up. The other thing we have to pay attention to is when we're doing nerve flosses, the general one is sit on a chair and extend the leg and flex the toes back and head goes back, and then leg bends at the knee and head tilts. If you're more flexible, the deeper you have to get into the position. We can also floss the nerve by doing our bent leg pike and extend. So think of the thing, instead of doing our good quality pike where we have a flexion in the cervical spine or neutrality in the cervical spine, we would extend the head, the neck, as we extend the hips in a standing pike, and then we would reduce the extension of the legs and tilt the head into flexion. This is another way of achieving the sciatic nerve floss in a position that will be closer to replicating our pike. It's the same when we are more flexible. If we have a very good quality pike, you might actually need to bring the leg up closer to the chest to actually effectively floss the nerve in these positions. Nerve restrictions are one of these things that, once again, if we go back to when I talked about it, we have an operating range of flexibility and we have a range that we need to develop. It will, if you are limited by the nerve, it will help you get to your operating range or a greater operating range, or reduce a limitation based on this. You're never going to floss your nerves to a full pike, and most of our stretching programs will include some type of nerve stretching. Once again, we can't, basically when we stretch something, we stretch everything. We try and target sensation when we're trying to go, but even when we're moving into position, the areas of a muscle, due to simple geometry, will be effectively in different stretches, because we're dealing with muscles which are big sack of something. And if the muscle is kind of thick, as I bend over, the back side of it will be further stretched because it has a longer and a bigger bend, because it's on the outside of the curve, than the interior side of it. So just bear that in mind. There's a lot of variance in stretching, even in muscles when we think we're targeting the right thing. And even when we go down, the stretch and the effective resistance coalesces in different points and kind of moves through the muscle. This is the same thing we see in resistance training when we want to effectively stimulate a muscle. Well, we need to not just do all our training that targets some, we want to target it in a mid-range, a stretched range, and a contracted range. And you see this, people familiar with Poliquin, he would use this a lot, these trisets, the origin, insertion, and midpoint trisets to develop a muscle. Same idea in stretching, that as we go deeper into positions, we will be changing which bit of the muscle is getting stimulated or getting maximal stimulation, and that will in turn affect the results. And this is when we begin to get changing sensation. I feel it at the top of my hamstring, I feel it lower. So just bear that in mind. When we're stretching everything, we probably are developing the nerves. If there's nerve inflammation and other stuff, see your physio or doctor. Don't look for advice on the internet. If the piriformis, this is the other thing, because of the different types of piriformis and sciatic nerve configurations, tension in the piriformis can compress the sciatic nerve and limit joint flexion. And it can also cause, once the nerve gets tensed, it can cause an excessive amount of tension in the muscles lower down as a protective mechanism to stop it being compressed further. So this is where we could, we need to work, we have sciatic type symptoms or sciatica type symptoms. We work on training the piriformis, developing the strength so it doesn't have to contract hard enough and can display more length at less tension, or get stronger. And then it has less muscular tension, and then it is not compressing the nerve as hard. So these are things to consider, and this is why, it's one of the things, no one ever really tries to strengthen their piriformis. Maybe you should try to get immense amounts of piriformis strength. Think about it that way. One of the other things I want to talk about is what is affectionately termed yoga butt. Yoga butt is basically an inflammation of the attachment of the hamstrings onto the ischial tuberosity. So is the hamstrings, they share this attachment at the back of the sit bones, and it can be inflamed for basically overtraining. If we just think about it, it's just simple overtraining. The inflammation is a reaction to excessive amount of stimulus. I can remember I was in Bali a few years ago, and I was there with my mother, and I was trying to encourage her to be more active. So I was let's go take some yoga classes, and if you like them, it's Christmas, I'll get you some yoga classes for Christmas and continue doing them in Dublin. So we'd done a yoga class, and the yoga class there was a vinyasa class, and there was so much hamstring positions. I think in and out of just a standing pike position, we passed between it about 50 or 60 times and over the course of the whole class, moving into stretch. In terms of movements that stretch the hip flexors and the anterior chain, bar like Cobra was obviously done, but there was nothing to target the front of the hip. So there's a bias in yoga, and you see this in yoga, of front folding. There is all the standing front folds, there's the seated forward folds, there's the legs apart forward folds, all this. So what we can see, once we've got the stimulus out of the weight of the torso that we're going to get,
then we might just be doing an excessive amount of repetitions, which are causing the tendonitis, because tendonitis is from overuse. So one of the ways of getting around this, and one of the fixes for it, is to get stronger in the hamstrings. And I get this question a lot, and I give everyone the same answer. Romanian deadlifts and lock knee deadlifts. These are one of the fixes for this, that you just want to find out what weight you're using, and for 5 to 10 reps, these zones, whatever you prefer, and get 60, 70, 100% stronger. Generally, we want to use a slower eccentric. We could also be fancy and use eccentric only training. I honestly haven't used it a lot in these positions, but it's definitely something worth trying. We want to get stronger at leg curls, and we almost just want to think, we just want to get the tissue thicker. We want bigger hamstrings, and these bigger hamstrings will then have a bigger cross-sectional area, which the load of the stretching will be more diffuse across, and this will hopefully give us more tensile strength because we have more cross-sectional area, which in turn will mean we are less predisposed to experiencing this underbutt or yoga butt pain. So generally in this, it's the same thing. Romanian deadlifts are the winning thing. Stiff leg deadlifts are another one. Speaking of the stiff leg deadlift, there is a couple of variations of this I'd like to talk about. In this position, with stiff leg deadlift or stiff leg hip hinge, we are fixing the spine roughly neutral, and we are hip hinging. One of the things we want to think about when we're looking at the hip hinge is that we want to actually make sure that the whole torso and the spine are linked and moving as a unit. And you see this a lot with people who are generally a bit more hypermobile, that if we put them parallel to the ground, generally the hip, so we'll use ideal numbers here, they might be 90 degrees flexion of the spine if we were to project this 90 degrees, if we were to project a line from the hip to the head and a line from the hip to the feet, and make a line, those two lines meet and they're 90 degrees. If we look at the hip tilt, the anterior tilt of the hip, they could be almost 20, 30 degrees more tilted in the hip going into anterior tilt. So it's one of these things that when you're training this, you want to be super rigid about not getting into extension in the spine. The spine stays neutral, ribs stay down, and then we're operating as a unit. I'm kind of like a robot on this hinge. This can be quite challenging for a lot of people, so work on it, particularly if you're more flexible, and think about it that way. The other variation of the straight leg forward fold, or not straight leg forward fold, the straight leg hip hinge, though it could be done in forward fold, there is a Jefferson curl variation. A lot of variations on the Jefferson curl, by the way. They're going to be in the courses we release eventually, but I might do some YouTube videos or put some of them up for a bit of fun. Is one, people just think like, oh, I always have my feet in the same position. You can vary the foot position from like the heels touching or close to it, to spaced apart by fist, to shoulder width. You can train all of them, and all of them, because of the geometry, will hit different segments of the hamstring. Once again, variability, target your weak link. And you can also test like, oh, can I go deeper in one position, and then I take the legs out and I can't go as deep. Oh, maybe I'll work in that one, and that could be once again a restriction. The other one we want to try out, and I'll finish on this, is we will take the feet slightly wider, and then we will internally rotate from the hips. So we're turning the knees in, not a lot, basically at our 1 o'clock position. Knees will point slightly inwards, and then we'll hip hinge from this position. This one can be a winner for a lot of people, particularly if you find you have a piriformis based restriction. Try it out, obviously report back, and can check in with a form check if you want. So that is a key exercise. Once again, this can be, these can be done once again for reps. Generally I like them for 8 to 10 repetitions with a pause on each rep of 2 to 3 seconds, using our iteration approach, trying to go deeper. If you can't go deeper, add more weight. As you add more weight, go deeper, blah blah blah. You talk about this. I have an article on progression as well somewhere on the website. So I think that is quite a big comprehensive kind of off the top of my head talk about the Pike. I hope you got a lot out of it, and I hope there's a lot of stuff in there to try out. Other than that, thanks for checking in. If you've gotten this far once again, the reviews are so useful to me. Likes on YouTube, all this stuff. It's it's super great. Feedback, questions, anything. I like to think I'm open to critique. So if there is critique, just send it to me, and don't worry, I won't be offended. Other than that, I am the Splits Wizard, Emmet Lewis, and this has been the Pike, and you have been listening to the Bendability podcast. Check us out on modernmobility.com for our website, and if you're interested in online coaching, we have we have a waiting list at the moment. We're going to clear that soon enough, hopefully. Other than that, have a good week, and I will speak to you next week.